Good morning, everybody, and welcome. Glad you could all make it for lunch. So I have a pleasure this morning to actually introduce an old friend and another native graduate. Gary Duretti, who basically is joining us from Duke University, where he's been on faculty there for about 30 years. He has had a really interesting, I think, background. He left Notre Dame as a sociology graduate. He went on to Yale, got a sociology degree there, and was focusing on the whole issue of business and society. Went on to the Harvard Business School for 3 years, worked with the very famous economist Raymond Berman there, looking at the whole issue of multinational corporations at the time when Raymond Berman was heading a big initiative at the Harvard Business School on that particular topic. And then went on to Duke to actually continue working on these issues and build the whole center there, both focusing on global value chains, and became very involved in working with both companies, state governments, and federal government on issues related to business and society and the sort of functioning of global value chains. And basically the framework that he developed in his career as a sociologist at Duke University became the basis of a project that the Rockefeller Foundation funded for building sort of a national, and I suppose you could say even international network of folks working on this particular things that using sociological analytics. So you could say he created a subfield of sociology, kind of maybe his legacy to the field of sociology as a profession like that. But what we wanted to do today was really use the opportunity of this visit to start a conversation really about the role or position or meaning of having a business presence or a focus on business within a school of global affairs. And Gary's had a really interesting history at Duke, where Duke undertook a very sort of interesting experiment starting back in the 1980s in terms of how it was handling this question of what was going to be the role of business in the university, particularly at the undergraduate level, but also at the sort of the MBA level. And they developed a kind of rather unusual program that then ended up being mimicked to some degree by Northwestern and to some degree Stanford, with variations nonetheless. More recently, however, I think one of the things that we want to kind of focus on today is it's a very exciting time to be working on business and global business, particularly because of all of what's going on, in terms of the return of industrial policy here in the United States, the impacts of sort of the ESG investor world on business leadership, and a variety of other sort of, I suppose you might say, changes in global geopolitics that are kind of moving us away from maybe you could say the rules-based system of the World Trade Organization to something of a more, a return of maybe a more mercantilist approach to kind of global trade. So we want to touch on a lot of those subjects today. And one of the things we're handing out today to you might have seen or hopefully you've gotten a copy of are two meetings, our agendas for two meetings that took place in Duke that are kind of focusing on these kinds of issues and give you a flavor for the sorts of topics that are being treated that are kind of a cross-section of what business is interested in, or what government is trying to do in terms of policy, and what universities can contribute possibly to research. So a lot of what where we're heading here is maybe a question about if universities are making contributions, what kind of contributions can they be making, or should they be making, and what disciplines should be involved in, concocting sort of these answers to really complicated questions that business leaders are asking that you're seeing represented in those particular events. So Gary's going to start off making a number of like opening comments. And we're going to run this a little bit like the faculty discussions where there's an opening set of remarks, but then we'd like to have a little bit more of a dialogue if we could with all of you. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Gary.
Great, thank you very much for the introduction. Real pleasure to be back at Notre Dame. And I think your setup was perfect because one of the issues I think you want to confront is we're in a period in the global economy when a lot of things are changing. We have global industries, we have new policies, but this question of what role universities can play and how do you bring the different area strengths of the university together to be part of these debates and contribute to them. I think that's what I can speak to based on my experience. And I think the EO School is a perfect place because you'll see there's elements that are similar to, but every university is going to do it in some different ways. So what I'd like to do is focus on three aspects of the work I've been doing at Duke. One is this undergraduate program that Ray mentioned. It was called Markets and Management Studies at Duke. It was created in the 1980s. But the idea was to bring more of a social science approach to business education rather than a strict business approach. Second was, if we're in this world of international business and increasingly global supply chains, how do universities build a research capability to do that, given that the work is so interdisciplinary? And we have people in different parts of the university, how do they come together? And then the third element is going to come back to these handouts Ray just mentioned. We've had a couple recent events having to do with the priority that we've had in the Biden administration around supply chain issues. And there was a 2022 supply chain ministerial that was organized by Secretary of Commerce Tina Raimondo and Secretary of State Tony Blinken that involved various people from different countries and academics. I'll tell you a little bit about that. But also 2 weeks ago, Duke had an event on the Chips and Science Act that was bringing together a lot of the parties that are involved in that new legislation. So we'll talk about that and then come back for comments from Ray, but especially questions and conversation with all of you. Yeah, Ray and I were together at Notre Dame, graduated in 70, and then I did 2 years of field work in Mexico in 1975 and 76, looking at multinational corporations in the pharmaceutical industry. So I was getting my PhD from the sociology department at Yale, but sociology was interested and open to international development as a key theme, and the role of multinationals in business was important for lots of reasons. So I spent 2 years in Mexico doing a lot of field work. And then fortunately, Raymond Berman, this professor who was at Harvard Business School, also at that time director of the Center for International Affairs, a little bit similar to what we have at Global Affairs, invited me to come for 1 year to help write up my dissertation because he had written a book on Mexico and he was heavily involved in this new research on the Harvard Multinational Enterprise Project. And he felt me being there, I could learn a lot that was useful for my dissertation, and that was certainly true. For 1 year, it became 3.5 years because I got involved in lots of different projects. And then I came to Duke in 1980. But that background at Harvard was really important because Vernon was a leader in terms of international business and many other areas. Like he chaired a New York City Metropolitan Planning Commission. He was very involved in setting up the Bretton Woods institutions in the 40s. So there was a set of intellectuals in the 40s, 50s, 60s that were very much a part of institution building in the post-war era. Ray Vernon was one of those people, but he was very interested in the empirical side of understanding the evolution of global business. And his multinational enterprise project and his book Sovereignty at Bay were sort of key landmarks. But what Ray really wanted me to come in for, besides helping with me with my dissertation, was he wanted to have his seminar at Harvard Business School talk about how do you research international business, not just how do you teach international business. And there were relatively few people that were doing field work involving multinational corporations and development. And since I was one of a group, and a number of us had been funded by Social Science Research Council to do work in different countries, especially in Latin America, there was a strong group there. I also helped Ray figure out how do you talk about doing research on international business. So now let me jump more to the Duke side of this. When I came to Duke in 1980, Duke was well known for international studies. They had a really strong Latin American studies program. They had a strong European studies program, and they were building up different area programs. Asia Pacific became really important. But a key person in this search committee that was looking to hire somebody with international business experience was a guy named Kenneth Pye. He was a professor in the law school, was chancellor of Duke at the time, and later became president of Rice University. And Pye really had this vision that universities need to become more global. We need to bring in all these extra skills. And how do you locate them in departments that are often traditionally narrow? So sociology was a place where he felt we could do bigger thinking. And when I got there, that's when we had this initiative on markets and management studies. So back before I came to Duke, Duke had a major in business administration for a number of decades. And then in the 1970s, they stopped it. 1970, they said, with business schools growing fast, MBA programs and Duke's business school was dynamic. A lot of universities, a lot of the research universities were thinking, maybe we really don't need an undergraduate major in business administration. Let students learn in all these other areas that we have available at the universities and take that knowledge if they go on and get MBA programs. So that lasted for a decade. But for lots of reasons, Duke was thinking, there's so many students at Duke that are going to go into business and other areas in the world that they should have some knowledge, but how could we set that up in an interdisciplinary way? And the initiative was to create something called Markets and Management Studies. That would be a certificate program at Duke. They asked sociology if they could be the leader, but we involved all the social science departments and even literature and others. So it was an undergraduate Trinity College program. And the idea was that so it's a certificate program. We had to identify 6 courses that would become interdisciplinary. It would be the hub, and then other courses would be chosen from existing courses in the curriculum. I taught a course on organizations and global competitiveness, for example, that reflected some of my research. When we set it up, the biggest major at Duke was economics, followed by psychology. And so one of the tensions in setting this up was, why wasn't economics asked to lead this initiative? Why was sociology asked to lead it? And I think partly it was because Duke was thinking, how do we create a bigger social science vision that's interdisciplinary? And sociology had plenty of people working on firms, industries, and networks. So we were a good bridge builder. And so we set that up, and within 5 years, it became far and away the most popular certificate program at Duke. 1 in 6 Duke graduates, 5 years after we started this, had their certificate in marketing and management studies. Undergrad, the Duke School of Business didn't have any connection to Duke undergraduate education. They did MBAs and PhDs and markets and management studies for the rest of the university. Really, really successful. Recently, last 5 years, Duke School has now said, hey, this markets and management studies idea is important. They've set up a 5-year BA MA program that is connected to undergraduate education. They've set up an innovation and entrepreneurship master's, also quite popular. But I think the initiative was really important. It really said places like Stanford, Northwestern, and a lot of other schools had discontinued business majors, traditional business majors, but they realized they wanted to get back in the game, but in a broader way. So I think this turned out to be really important. One of the complaints when talking about this with faculty colleagues, especially my economics colleagues, is to say, well, why shouldn't a set of economics courses be the basis for markets and management studies? If people are going to go into international business, they need to know that stuff. And it turns out that undergrads at Duke walked into businesses after they graduated at MBA programs. They worked in consulting firms and the like. So the evidence though was to go back to the colleagues and say, company like Goldman Sachs recruits really heavily at Duke. So I said, let me go back and I'm going to look at the last 10 Duke graduates that were hired by Goldman Sachs to see what their major was. Because their argument in economics was, if they're not an economics major, they're not going to be able to contribute to the thinking about international business. I did that. Turned out 4 of the majors were econ. 4 of the last Goldman Sachs hires were econ majors. 2 of them were comparative area studies. 2 of them were philosophy majors, and 2 other majors. And talking to the Goldman Sachs recruiters, when they would come to Duke, they said, we want people that can think broadly. We want people that can write clearly, think crisply, and we don't really care what their major is, but kind of we prefer interdisciplinary folks. So they really were supporting the vision that Duke had, that if you set up a program that way, you're not excluding economics. In that case, business wasn't part of it. So I think that was a different model. And after Duke did this, other schools began to realize this made sense for them too. That you could do business education, but in a broad way, not a narrow. So let me now fast forward. How do you teach international business in this arena? And so because of the work I had done in Mexico, I worked in pharmaceutical industry in Mexico. And at that time, the industry I was focusing on was part of what was called the Wonder Drug Revolution. There was certain products that were used to develop cortisone and cortisone derivatives and the active ingredients and oral contraceptive. A lot of that was coming out of some new chemistry that was being done. Mexico had set up a fledgling company called Syntex. It was made up of different international scientists. And the research was around how that industry evolved in Mexico. There was 3 European multinationals, 3 US multinationals. They were competing to control the direction of technology change in that industry. So part of my research was, how does the Mexican government and these big multinationals negotiate a rapidly changing technology environment where Mexico wanted to get some control over that, multinationals resisted, but you also had a competition between European multinationals. The study was fascinating to do, and Syntex later became a global multinational, moved from Mexico to California, to Palo Alto. But because that work was so interesting, the UN had created a UN Center on Transnational Corporations in New York in '76. They came to me when I was at Harvard in '77, '78, and they said, that study you did in Mexico on multinationals, pharmaceuticals seems really important. Help us figure out how you do global industry study. How can we study the pharmaceutical industry worldwide, not just 6 multinationals? And they asked me to do a study on the 50 top pharmaceutical multinationals in the world that they could use for developing countries who wanted to be involved in the pharmaceutical industry. So that meant recreating a structure of the global industry from the top down. The biggest multinationals, their nationality, where they were located, what parts of the pharmaceutical industry they were in. And I spent probably 15 months doing this. Every 3 months, I had to go back to New York, show my drafts, and defend it line by line because the UN had the Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Association, the International Federation of Pharmaceutical Manufacturers, and other groups that were stakeholders. And it was really a great exercise, and we learned how to set up a global industry study. And that led to this work that I've been doing on global value chains, because academics interested in multinationals and development, we didn't have a way to look at the total automobile industry, computer industry, pharmaceutical industry, the way we do now. Now everybody's aware that these are global supply chains and total international industries. So part of the challenge that was illuminated by this work I was doing at UN Center on Multinationals was developing a framework. The Rockefeller, now I'll go to step 2. How do you create a research capability to do that? The Rockefeller Foundation pulled together different groups of scholars who were looking, some at global industries, like I was doing, pharmaceuticals, others who were looking at local economic clusters. A lot of those people were in Europe, and Silicon Valley, Route 128 in Boston were famous examples, but that was very local. And then others who were looking at national industrial policies, like what Japan was doing, Korea. And the Rockefeller Foundation said all of these fields or layers, the global, the national, the local, seem to be part of this emerging global economy, but we don't have a framework to tie them all together. So they gave 5 years of money, and they identified 18 initial researchers and said, could you guys meet, bring in colleagues, build a trajectory to create a new framework. The 3 leaders of that, there was a guy from MIT, Tim Sturgeon, John Humphrey was at the University of Sussex in the UK, and I was at Duke. And it's fascinating meetings. At the end of 5 years, we did a lot of bridge building and progress in creating the framework. But what they wanted to know, Rockefeller says at the end, okay, you now have launched an international network of scholars. You've got elements of a framework that wasn't there before. We now see how you can link global, local business. But now how's it going to be institutionalized? What's going to happen after you've done this? They said, we need to set it up in a university, because universities are going to be the monitor of how this grows as a field. So they asked me if I could set it up at Duke. I came back at Duke, talked to the provost at the time, Peter Lang, who I know has also been involved with some of the discussions here at Notre Dame. And Peter had set up something called the Social Science Research Institute, set up this center on global value chains. At that time it was called Globalization, Governance, and Competitiveness. It didn't kind of flow off your lips very well, so we had to change the acronym, but it became this Global Value Chain Center. And I ended up hiring, no money to start, very little money. I mean, I was there, they gave us office space, research assistant, administrator, but then said, now you have to go and raise the money. If this is a good way to view the world and show us the value of the framework. And it was fascinating. That's how I first met Ray, because groups like Oxfam America were very interested in issues, in his case, their case, food and inequality. They had to work with researchers who were able to come up with numbers and do evidence-based science. So our first big projects actually were with the Environmental Defense Fund. And the Environmental Defense Fund, big NGO, had a division that was called Clean Technology and U.S. Funds. This was just in the campaign before Obama, the first Obama administration. There was a lot of debate about clean energy, U.S. tech jobs and clean energy. And EDF came to us and they had a very strong presence in Washington. And they said, we want you to look at this question of clean technology and U.S. jobs by identifying, and we started out with 5 products that are low carbon products. One of them was LED lights, for example, or solar panels. And they said, we want your research team to do 3 things. For each of those products, give us a value chain map or supply chain map of what the components are that go into that product. The raw materials, the critical components, the final product, and then who the consumers are, the demand side. Second, create a map or a table of the factories in the US that produce those key components for LED lights, let's say. And then third, estimate the number of jobs that those factories are generating. And and this was co-sponsored by the AFL-CIO, EDF, and other groups. They were sort of thinking along the lines of what they call the Blue-Green Alliance. That they were saying clean energy actually has a very strong US manufacturing component. But the two sides don't really understand how you build that together. So the studies we did, they initially wanted to print 2,000 reports. They had ties with all the congressional staff in manufacturing states in the US. So what they wanted to do as part of their bigger campaign is to convince people in the United States and Congress that manufacturing would benefit if the US also goes down a clean energy or low carbon path. And it was really successful. Those 2,000 copies that disappeared immediately. And it was a way to inform a discussion that was still very inchoate because of the Obama campaign. This number was 5 million green jobs in the US or jobs related to low carbon products. But nobody knew where that number 5 million. So we did that. The thing that was important, I think, is in creating a group of 10 researchers, we had to find clients who really cared about these issues. So the Environmental Defense Fund was one, Oxfam America was another, but we had to do things on high-speed rail or the buses. We worked with a lot with the International Labor Organization. They were one of our first groups. They said, well, we're also interested in the global economy, but our concern is whether all these assembly jobs that are being created around the world are good jobs. So they had a project on global production and local jobs. We had to do different things with them. We worked with the World Trade Organization. So I think what happened is as this framework became established and as we were able to do new studies that were really visible, and a key thing from a university point of view, every report we get has to be public domain. So we're not doing consulting. And that was a big battle with the funders or the people that manage grants inside Duke, because they're used to NSF grants, NIH grants, where you have a big grant, a 5-year project, a team, and you pay people salaries, and then you're done. And so that the question was, well, how can we be sure that this isn't considered consulting work? Because if this is labeled consulting work, then we're taxable, just like a McKinsey would do. And so he said, no, this is all the public domain. And that was a really important aspect of what we did because it gave us credibility. And I remember one group that was skeptical because we had some companies wanted to work with us, private companies especially, and we just said, when they heard the terms, they would love to do the project, but we can't do it in this way. And one of the groups that we worked with was the World Health Organization. They had a big tobacco eradication program, and they were trying to convince countries in Africa and Asia, how you move out of tobacco into other crops. They wanted us to evaluate what they had studied. And we said, we'd love to do that. But in their internal discussions, they balked at this idea that when we're done with the report, it goes out, you don't have right of first refusal. And they were a little worried that what if you criticize our programs as being ineffective? Isn't that going to be a bad thing? And in the end, they said, no, we want to work with the university because you have credibility in the university precisely for objectivity, but you're also bringing a lot of different types of skills and knowledge to bear on the project. So in the end, I think it was a great thing that we did it that way. So I think we found a way to build a research unit, and it was very interdisciplinary as well. In this case, it was part of the Social Science Research Institute too. Notre Dame will have different ways to think about that. But let me go to the last point, and this will sort of wrap up my remarks. What does that all mean today? I mean, how is this reflecting itself in this era where we have so much public policy interest in supply chains, competitiveness, strategic industry? For me, the game changer was COVID-19, the pandemic. Because before the pandemic, supply chains were seen as something taught in business schools, supply chain management. It was logistics oriented, cost, speed, delivery. Didn't really have anything to do with bigger strategic questions or national security issues or societal challenges. But when the pandemic hit, we had product shortages in all these different areas. Then part of the product shortage question was, well, how do you build up that supply? And then international business came into the equation because they realized, well, a lot of the production of goods we consume in the US are actually happening in other countries. So 90% of antibiotics are imported from China and India. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? And so businesses had to discuss how and why they have the local operations they do. And governments had to figure, how do we build capacity fast? So I think it was an important area in which the complexity of industries was illustrated. But I think the point I would emphasize about what the Biden policy is, there's a 21st century industrial policy debate that we're in now that's very different from the 20th century industrial policy debate. The last time we had these kind of discussions was in the 1980s, when there was a lot of concern about Japan Inc. Japan was considered, and Germany closely behind. Japan and Germany had rebuilt their economies as powerhouses. They were exporting all kinds of goods to the US and other European markets. And in particular in the US, the resistance was, if Japan is just exporting cars, to take that example, or Korea is exporting television sets or other kinds of electronics, US market share is going down the tubes, US industries are being decimated. And the tools that we used then were trade related because we're dealing with final products. So for Japan, we had something called voluntary export restraints on the automobiles. We claimed that there would be a limit on how many automobiles Japan could export for Germany or Korea. And then the other big policy was currency revaluation. So the idea was that the yen or the Deutschmark was valued too low. So by those two levers, we were able to insulate the US from a lot of this overseas production. Now, what happened that maybe wasn't anticipated by US companies is those countries then started to set up investment in the US in the very industries that were being bought. So you have all this wave of Japanese, German, Korean auto plants. So now in the US, half of our production is done by foreign-owned automakers and only half by the US automakers. But from a workforce point of view, and technology point of view, I think it turned out to be a good thing. There's a lot of skills and jobs created, a whole new way of doing supply chain management that was for Toyota. So I think that was all sort of relevant. But what's happening now, 21st century industrial policy, if you look at what Biden created when he had a 100-day report, strategic US industries came out in June 2021, 4 was mentioned: semiconductors, active ingredients for pharmaceuticals, batteries for electric vehicles, and rare earth minerals. Not a final product on the list. These are all strategic intermediate goods that tie into all these other industries. So part of 21st century industrial policy is understanding that these complex international supply chains have critical areas of vulnerability and strength. And the question was, how does the US recreate strategic industries? So that's when these events come in. The one on chips and science, it was 2 weeks ago at Duke, I think was perfect example of what universities can do. One of the business school professors at Duke, a guy named Ronnie Chatterjee, had been hired as the chief economist for the Secretary of Commerce, Dina Raimondo. And then in year 2, when Chips and Science Act was passed, he was asked to oversee the negotiations with semiconductor firms who would want to get US government subsidies. And part of his team was to build a pretty long list of requirements. Because if you're going to get a subsidy and trying to learn from the experiences of past industrial policy, you wanted to do it in waves. You wanted to have counterpart measures by companies to assure that they're not going to take the money and run, that they have a lot of things they've got to do. And they've had like 230 applications for these subsidies. But the other really important thing is you've got a local ecosystem that has to be created in the states where these investments are going to take place. Workforce development is a huge part of that, and permitting requirements. So what was interesting to me about this event is co-sponsored by the business school, the law school, public policy. And each of them felt that they had something different to contribute. And the companies that came in were also critical. So you have Intel, you have IBM, but Wolfspeed, for example, is a company, it used to be called Cree. It was a spin out of North Carolina State University, in the US. All these companies were coming to this meeting, also reflecting the questions they now have about how to operate in this post-pandemic world. Even though subsidies are pouring in, they're full of questions that need research answers. And to me, very important was that the NSF, National Science Foundation, was a key element there because they are a major recipient of some of the funds coming from the chips and science. The ant science part is a lot about NSF. So when these people all came together, I mean, Ronnie was talking about the kind of negotiations that were going on with international business, but another key person here was Liz Reynolds from MIT. She ran the Industrial Performance Center at MIT. But she was in charge of the White House group to put together that 4 industry strategic report. So in these discussions, the question Ronnie was asking, and talked about it a lot beforehand, he's been 2 years in Washington, he's back at Duke. How can he continue to work on these issues for the next 10 years? Because industrial policy has so many layers. I mean, the industrial policy and the implications of trying to rebuild manufacturing, revitalize strategic industries, and pay attention to environmental issues. You need a whole of university approach. And so I think that the fact that these 3 parts of Duke came together and that this was just the first conversation, and I was impressed by how much the companies feel they need to know that they don't really know. Let me just quickly turn to the second item on the handout, and then I'll stop for comments. Part of this broader discussion as the US is thinking about how to rebuild strategic value chains or supply chains was how this is going to play with our allies and our partner countries, US, Mexico, Canada, or linked Europe, et cetera. So they had this 2022 supply chain ministerial headquartered by Commerce and State. So Tony Blinken and Gina Raimondo are there. They wanted to pull together, I guess, 70 different participants from different countries. And they did it as a big WebEx call, so 90 minutes, but they used academic facilitators to try to create the foundation for a discussion and then do report backs on what people were saying. So it's just interesting. If you look at the session titles, there's one called Crisis Response, another called Diversifying Supply Chains, a third one on Transportation and Logistics, and a fourth one on Workforce Development. So the way they set it up is Secretary Blinken and Raimondo gave some opening remarks. This is all, of course, had been prepped beforehand by the staffers. Then there was this conversation in the 4 breakout groups. And then they wanted to report back at the end. So in 90 minutes, they kind of wanted to say, how can all of us agree on next steps? And I'll just tell you quickly, when we did the crisis response, the session I was responsible for, we did a PowerPoint slide with 4 simple points that came out of this discussion. Point number 1, keep markets open, avoid overregulation. These are the concerns. Point number 2, coordinate responses to these supply chain crises ahead of time to reduce uncertainty, because uncertainty hits small, medium firms hardest, and also vulnerable groups in these different countries disproportionately. Point 3, figure out a way to improve supply chain monitoring. So in the future, you're not scrambling quite as much to understand how these industries are orchestrated. And fourth, ensure adequate workforce. And I think the workforce skills part of this is a huge issue for all these new industries. We're needing new kinds of skills. So again, universities are creating skills and students. But I would just emphasize that besides the content of what we teach students, teaching students how to research business itself has strategic implications. And I think what the Keough School does in terms of how it's positioned, business school here, different social science or other university, engineering, all those departments can and have to work together. And Duke, I think, is just an illustration. MIT is doing similar things, Stanford's doing similar things of how to get universities involved in these bigger discussions, but to do what universities do best, which is partly to do research, but also to bring together people from different knowledge backgrounds to create strategic thinking around these sorts of issues. So let me stop there with my opening remark.
So maybe what I'll do is, and maybe ask all of you to think about it, what questions you might have for Gary, but maybe I'll just sort of do an opener to kind of get us both going. I mean, here at the Keough School, obviously, when we were created, it was, the premise that we were going to be focused on international development, poverty and inequality issues, very consistent with Catholic social teaching, strong normative question related to those issues. How does all of this change industrial policy, the impacts on the global trading system? What's it mean for developing countries and for some like you might be tracking what you're thinking about our world in that world beyond the industrial discussions that are going on between all the what you might say the major powers as well.
Yeah.
And then maybe I'll just add to that. Maybe you can say something about we're in Indiana, major manufacturing state. There's a lot going on in Indiana trying to, you're trying to think about future work, upskilling the labor force. Can we attract more investment? I'm not convinced we have a robust strategy at the state level yet for doing this. And how could work in these particular areas maybe give Indiana maybe a more strategic boost, if I put it that way.
Okay, great question. Okay, let me two comments back. I think part of the development questions you were asking is you need a framework that's looking at international business where development is integral to how you're thinking about it. So that was the advantage of our global value chain approach. We had a top down and a bottom up set of analytics. The top down part of analytics was how do you analyze global industries from a firm perspective? Who are the big companies? Who are the most powerful companies? What kind of networks do they create? They set up their production and trade relationships. But the other part that was typically missing in business approaches and supply chain management is this development piece. All of those industries are situated in countries where these questions of inequality are going to come up. Access, skills development. And so I think because we have sort of framed it that way from the beginning, it makes it much easier to talk about, in the language of the BBC approach, different pathways of upgrading. We had economic upgrading and different ways to do that, but we also had social upgrading, environmental upgrading, and what groups like the International Labor Organization or others bring into the picture, or Oxfam America, is how do you put those pieces together? The economic plus the social plus environmental, and how's that situated in developing countries? So one thing we learned, we do the global industry piece, is that industry, take any global industry, there's going to be a handful of developing countries for which that industry is critical. And so I think being able to bring those countries into the equation is important, but it's also important inside the US because development is, and all development people know, is an uneven process. And what we're really studying with development is the unevenness part. It's not just that markets solve all problems, but how are these things impacting different groups? And even just in the normal process of technology change. So like my dad was a watchmaker. He was in Pittsburgh. When we moved down to Florida, my brothers and I wanted him to teach us watchmaking. He said he wasn't going to do it because the technology had already changed enough in watchmaking that it had totally moved to the kind of more modularized types of watches. And the same thing is true for lots of other industries. So I think we have to be able to deal with how changes affect regions and countries. This brings it up to your Indiana story. So one thing that I was really interested in at Duke when we were doing markets and management studies is when I was teaching global competitiveness, I had a lot of students saying, so what does that mean for North Carolina or other states that they're from in the US? And we had a big group from North Carolina. So I said, that's a perfect question. And we created a project called North Carolina and the Global Economy, using exactly the same tools from the global value chain approach. And we looked at 7 key industries: textile, tobacco, textiles, furniture. So in those 3 industries, North Carolina was the #1 producer in the US for many years. Then we looked at information technology and biotechnology. We looked at finance, which is based in Charlotte, and Hong Kong. The idea was a state like North Carolina is a microcosm. Like Indiana could be. When we did this, but we wanted to do this in a way that we had lots of information on the supply chain of every industry, number of firms, jobs, etc. When we launched this as a website, within a week, I had people from Massachusetts, Michigan, and Pennsylvania coming to say, how could we do the same thing for our states? Because from a state level point of view, and we've worked a lot with people in the North Carolina Department of Commerce, they said, we're always trying to recruit investment coming into North Carolina. But we need a better screen. If we're trying to figure out what are the supply chain opportunities or what are the supply chain gaps, we need to understand North Carolina's strengths more specifically. So I think there's a really nice way in which you can build the development piece, not just internationally, not just global South, but inside the US or inside a particular state. The difference or the key thing today is we need tools to understand industries with much higher levels of specificity or granularity than we did in the past. We need to think about them as this supply chain of all these different parts. Yeah, if you just take something like these new vaccines that have come out with the COVID vaccines, a company like AstraZeneca has 26 manufacturing partners in 15 different countries that it has to deal with when it's doing its vaccines. So I think the complexity of these supply chains means the research side needs to be able to help understand how the industry is organized so that the policy people or the business people coming in can make more informed decisions.
Let me open it up for a question. Yes.
Thank you for interesting discussions. I have one concern because it seems like U.S. research network is really concentrating developing new industrial policy. And what the problem is unless it's coordinate with other countries' industrial policies, it causes a trade conflict. You know, I'm talking about Japan, China, Korea. Semiconductor industry is one example. US doesn't have any comparative advantages in semiconductors. If you push in industrial policy, it's the US will be losers anyway. I think seems to me US needs to coordinate like China, Japan, or South Korea. They are on advanced stage of industrial policy. So my concern is, what do you think about the research which has to be coordinated with other countries? Otherwise, we get into the trade war, which is happening, right?
Great point. Two responses. One, it's absolutely true that these new global industries have key players in all parts of the world that have some unique capabilities. You know, what TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corp, can do in terms of advanced semiconductor production, no other company in the world is quite that good yet. So there's a set of lead firms that come from a variety of countries, but even on the equipment side, the lithography companies, one country in the Netherlands is the leader in producing the advanced machinery. So, point one, in doing industrial policy for any of these global industries, we have to realize that there's a pattern of international diffusion and specialization that is built in and isn't going to change. You cannot bring these industries back to one country anymore. It's just fruitless to even try. So that's one recognition, but it raises a really big political challenge, and that's why that supply chain ministerial meeting that I mentioned was really important. I think the people in commerce and the State Department in the US and the Biden administration more generally realize that industrial policy isn't just about picking winners and losers. That was always a criticism, and a legitimate criticism of policy. In this case, it's about strengthening capabilities, but realizing you're in an international network. So a couple examples surprised me about the legislation. When the Biden administration passed the Inflation Reduction Act, those three big bills that Biden administration did, CHIPS Act, Inflation Reduction Act, bilateral infrastructure bill, were done quite fast, very big, first 2 years of the administration, and problems in getting the details right. So when they did the Inflation Reduction Act, one of the clauses said it has key components to get subsidies have to be made in the United States. And Mexico and Canada quickly were on the phone to the policymakers and said, what about us? We're part of a North American free trade agreement. The legislative people said, we got that wrong. You're absolutely right. We're ready. So they went back and they revised it and said, the key components for Inflation Reduction Act have to be bought in North America. So part of it is to get the policy right, given that you've got all these international partnerships, you need flexibility, you need outreach. And one other example was around electric vehicles. The Europeans were really concerned because they're saying US is passing these, issuing these large subsidies. European companies are going to go to the US to make semiconductors, and we're going to lose part of that industry. But in particular, we're concerned about electric vehicles because automotive is a very big industry in Europe, just like it is in the US. And it seemed like these laws were too restrictive, that it said these things have to be built in the US or in North America to qualify. And the electric vehicles, again, flexibility that I didn't expect. They said, you're right. And they changed the legislation to say if an electric vehicle is leased rather than bought, parts can come from a broader set of countries than just North America. So I think the answer is in figuring out how to create sensible industrial policy that's short-term, builds capabilities. We need a back and forth between business, policymakers, and different groups, and you have to have an open process. That's why that second part was you got these international partnerships, and those are going to matter. So we need a different mentality. You can't just think it's a simple process. You need policy flexibility.
Hi. How long do you think we'll still be seeing the effects of COVID on supply chains? Do you think there will be a return to normal? And if not, what does that new normal look like?
I think that, thanks for the question. The first 2 years of COVID were totally unprecedented because it moved so fast. 4 months, it circled the globe. It affected both supply and demand. So people couldn't go to work in factories, but also all the demand side industries, airlines, entertainment, restaurants, everything was disrupted. And it affected all industries at the same time. So it kind of had a speed and a scope and a scale that were unmatched. I think from a supply chain point of view, actually, we're well beyond the worst. And I think that COVID's impact is more lasting on the medical side, actually, than it is on the supply chain side. In the sense that with the new vaccines coming out in a year, I think was critical. Because at the beginning, COVID was a disease that was life-threatening. Now with these vaccines, people are saying treat it like a flu. I mean, the flu kills 60 or 70,000 people in the US every year. Flu's not an easy thing, but it's a managed threat. I think that's where we are with COVID. And I think on the supply chain side, those disruptions within 18 to 24 months, I think the industries were being put back together again. But I think this notion of resilience is what people are rethinking. How do you rebuild an industry that was fragmented and broken? firms are part of it. Public policy is another part, but also the geographic configuration of these industries. So I think that's the way people are thinking about it. We need a new conception of resilience in international business to say when you build these things back, it's going to be multi-layered. So I think the supply chain part, we're beyond that now. But the medical part, we are sort of dealing with the vaccine breakthroughs that were super important, and the fact that they came from China, Russia, US, Europe. It was a global effort. I think the biggest part in the vaccines is distribution of vaccines. That's what the WHO is really concerned.
Thank you. Thank you, Gary. And you, Ray, if I understand, I'm going to ask a different kind of question. And if I understand your charge to us here, it's within the scope. It has to do with like sort of centering this capability. I think that's what Ray's thinking about. I mean, Ray is why we love him. And when he's starting to think about something institution building wise, we all pay attention. And so, you know, at Duke, so you know Duke, you know here, I guess from your historical connection, it's a very different place, of course. You know, I think 25% of our undergraduates are roughly are undergraduates in the Mendoza College of Business. We're having this conversation here in the Keough School. You know, we can go on features of the environment. My sense of the magic in what you did there was that it was a big idea, kind of a scholarly rooted idea, kind of new on the scene that helped bring a bit of cohesion, I guess, to what was happening. It wasn't really centered, if I understand you correctly. It was really distributed amongst sociologists, economists, business school folks, other. So I guess I'm just trying to think about, like, as far as the question of institution building goes here, you know, what are the lessons, or what could we, how could we think about approaching this? So I guess I'll stop there, but it's not very specific, I guess.
No, but I think it's a great question. The institution building part of it is absolutely critical. And you're right. One of the big advantages Duke had was because it had discontinued its undergraduate business program for a decade. It was kind of starting fresh again in the 1980s. So it wasn't trying to figure out how do you reconfigure an existing big program, 25% of the students. That was part of it. And it allowed Duke to do some new things, but you still had a lot of important entrenched interests. The fact that economics is the biggest major at Duke, and economics felt that they had a big role in talking about market management, and how do they fit into this new interdisciplinary vision was a good discussion that we had. And I think we all agreed that the new way of approaching this in an interdisciplinary fashion would work. I think that a big part of this is really how do you build up a research component. I think one thing that's true of Notre Dame probably, and a lot of business schools, is that their core job traditionally has been training people in business skills, training managers of the future, et cetera. But business schools traditionally didn't think about themselves as researching international business. That's a relatively new field. And so I think that would be one of the challenges, is how do you bring in some research capabilities that are addressing these new global realities? Industrial policy is up. China is a big competitor. We've got climate change and other sustainability concerns. So as a university that wants to grapple with big challenges, and I know Notre Dame is exactly on that page, how do you do it given the current configuration? So quick answer to me is start to create some people and courses that are looking at researching international business, that are able to pull from some of the tools that have evolved over the last 20 years in the social sciences, and start to add a research capability to the existing capability. But I'm sure here others have ideas, but that's the right question. How do you do it in an institutional setting?
Another question here. First, thank you very much. Very insightful. When you spoke about the new, oh.
Okay, once again, thank you, very insightful. When you
Tell us who
spoke,
you are. We know, but tell them.
all right. When you spoke about my name is Alfonso. I come from the College of Business, Mendoza. I teach supply chain management and logistics. And you spoke about the change in strategic focus of the administration from finalized products to raw materials and intermediate products. And, that made me think about petroleum, for example. That's a raw material, and typical extraction in developing countries is associated with armed conflict and war. So my question is, with this new strategic objectives, is there any consideration for the potential impact of extraction of these new strategic components in countries of origin, like in Africa or Latin America and so on? And what lessons have been learned from the past, if any? And how do you see this to the future?
Great question, and it's a super hot, important issue. So among the materials that are needed for this new generation of electric vehicles and smartphones and the like are these critical minerals, lithium, cobalt, and others. And the traditional places that they have come from have often been very conflict-ridden countries. So we know about the blood diamonds and all the stories about how extraction is tied into very conflict-ridden situations and other vulnerable groups. So I think that those issues are very central now to how business is thinking about these questions. And I think lithium is a particularly good example because it raises some of these issues about what are the conditions under which you're going to be able to get these materials, but it's changing the alliances in some interesting ways. So Mexico, for example, has lithium. They decided to nationalize the lithium industry under a state-owned firm. Canada also has lots of lithium and many other natural resources, abundant hydroelectric power in Quebec. Canada is thinking about it as a different supplier, but they've also got indigenous tribes issues in terms of the land where that's relevant. So I think this is why you need the law school people and the ethics people together with the international business people, because those issues have to be worked out. And I mentioned that in the semiconductor plants that are being built in the US right now, permitting issues are among the biggest problems, that these plants take 2 years often to get the super sites situated because they have a lot of environmental issues they have to go through. They have land rights issues. So I think the complexity of the ethical and political and environmental conditions is now part of what people have to try to solve. And that's why I think we need a kind of strategic thinking about supply chain issues that we didn't necessarily need before, when it was just about with transportation and logistics, cost, speed, all of that. Now, these other issues are definitely front and center. And the question is, how do you deal with them effectively, but also speed up the kind of development that people are doing is needed?
We have time for one more. Anybody?
Yeah, and this almost kind of repeats the previous question, but takes in a little different direction.
Yeah.
And thank you for your good talk. I'm Hal Culbertson. I am a faculty member here at the Keough School, and I'm curious to hear a little more. You've said some about it in answering the last questions about ethics and supply chain management, because it seems like that's where a lot of the ethical issues arise, is when you either have a supplier in a location that has human rights violations or a conflict, or you have a supplier that is not adhering to labor standards and things like that. And there's a whole slew of, to me, quite interesting and complicated ethical questions about whether you work with that supplier, whether you move somewhere else. Do you try and make that supplier do better things? And you've kind of answered this a little bit, but I'm curious how much that's been part of your program. And if we were to try and think about the ethical issues of supply chain management, what would be good areas for us to focus on?
Great question. And I think, and I'm going to let Ray jump in, but he anticipates part of our response, because as we develop a set of research skills, the way this research unfolds and the issues it addresses has everything to do with the clients that are asking for answers to these questions. So when we worked with Oxfam America, and they were very interested in these inequality or land rights issues, and they posed that as central parts of what our research agenda is, you've got to tackle those things front and center. And I'll let Ray speak more about it. But I think besides the land rights issues and vulnerable populations and other obvious ethical concerns, I think there's another big area, which is part of this uneven development problem. As if we start thinking about areas of the United States, so I come from Pittsburgh, so areas of the United States that at one point had certain big industries, and now those industries have been eclipsed by other kinds of industries, and especially in middle America and rural America, there's this problem of what do you do when technology change or trade or other issues leads industries to disappear? How do you build back those industries? So that's more the inequality or the uneven development. But I think that's where trade theory would say, okay, we know that trade is going to have uneven impact. It's those technological change. 70% of the job shift in an economy, and the US economy, is from technological change. Only 30% comes from trade. So the fact that technologies are constantly moving means industries are moving. And this back to the Indiana question, the North Carolina question. How do we set up smart policies in particular places that are going to say, what do we do when North Carolina loses its furniture industry or when tobacco moves out? And so some of that change you want, but it doesn't lessen the impact on these communities that are now left with nothing from what had been a key. So to me, that's one big issue to add to the list of the ethical concerns. And maybe let Ray wrap up with his observation.
So this is where we started working together, because basically what happened at Oxfam, and not just at Oxfam, but a lot of the other not-for-profit groups, we realized we were suddenly doing traditional development work in the era of globalization. And we had to think a little bit about, well, what does it mean if we're in this period of globalization where major corporations and our own government are actually challenging other nations to actually liberalize their economies, drop all tariff and trade barriers. In other words, conform to our models of what development should be about. So we really had to think a lot harder about, well, where do we position in on these poverty and ethical questions? And so I think what we actually realized was that if you actually think about globalization as maybe moving people, ideas, technologies around the world at warp speed for profit, the architecture that makes all that work is supply chains. But right to your point, we realized supply chains is the window into globalization. And all the issues that we cared about were actually, you could actually look at through a supply chain window. In other words, because if indigenous are being exploited in Canada or Chile, it's through a supply chain for a mineral like copper that somebody wants to get and wants to get it cheap. And they're willing to kind of do certain things that are unethical because they want to get it fast, they want to get it cheap. But how do you intermediate that relationship between the indigenous people and that corporation in the way that you forward these ethical concerns? And so that then led us to kind of try to figure out how could we propose radical sustainability challenges to industry in their supply chains, and then basically be doing x-rays and diagnostics of their supply chains to identify slavery. We found slavery in supply chains. We found land robbing in supply chains. We found abuse of women workers in supply chains. I mean, we found murder in supply chains. I mean, it was endless. And the opportunities for ethical treatment within the kind of sustainability framework is abundant. And so now I think, maybe just to conclude, I think where we're sort of coming out in terms of what the Keough School proposition could be, would be embracing the sustainability frame, because that's where all the ethical opportunity is. And then actually embracing the notion of competitiveness. In other words, whether it be in Indiana or internationally, in terms of like how do industries perform better in this new world, without us all becoming balkanized and kind of doing some sort of a retrograde form of globalization to kind of bring it all home and and then sort of go into trade wars with the world. What's a more peaceful oriented version of globalization in a 21st century version that's both normative and sustainable? And that's, I think, what we ought to represent as a school, maybe in terms of the kind of ideas that Gary's been presenting. We're a little over time, but listen, thank you all for coming. I hope you found it stimulating, and we're hoping to continue this conversation. This is just the start of what we hope to do in the future. So thanks very much.